They say sound can't exist in a vacuum, but they haven't been where I've been, haven't heard what I now carry in the hollows of my ears. It's not a sound, not really. It's the shape of silence, the weight of a presence that has no voice but speaks in the cessation of all others. I am Daniel Walker, and I host The Midnight Coil on WZHP 97.3 FM, the voice of Red Hollow, Maine. A quaint title for a frequency that has become my confessional, my prison, and perhaps my tomb. The job was meant to be a new start, a quiet harbor after the storm that took Anna, my wife, whose final silence still echoes louder than any broadcast I've ever delivered. Red Hollow itself is a town caught in amber, nestled deep in the Maine woods, where the trees press in close, their branches like skeletal fingers scratching at the sky. It's the kind of place where a stranger remains a stranger for a generation, and secrets are cultivated like prize-winning pumpkins, kept plump and hidden in the dark. The station, WZHP, is an old clapboard building on the edge of town, its paint peeling, its antenna a rusty spire piercing the often overcast sky. It felt less like a place of communication and more like a forgotten reliquary, a shrine to voices long since faded into static. The air inside always smelled faintly of dust, old vacuum tubes, and something else, something metallic and cold, like ozone before a lightning strike. My predecessor, George Whitmore, had vanished. Left abruptly was how Miss Karen Matthews, the station manager, had phrased it, her eyes not quite meeting mine. She was a woman of sharp angles and even sharper silences, her professionalism a thin veneer over something I couldn't quite name. Weariness, perhaps, or a carefully guarded knowledge. The studio for The Midnight Coil was his old domain, a small, soundproofed room crammed with vintage equipment. A massive, coffin-like mixing console dominated one wall, its VU meters like unblinking eyes. Reels of tape lined the shelves, their labels faded, names and dates obscured by time and neglect. I found a strange comfort in the solitude of the late hours, the hum of the equipment a steady companion. The microphone, a heavy chrome thing, felt like a conduit to a sleeping world, a world I could speak to without expecting a reply. It was a one-way conversation, much like my internal dialogues with Anna had become. I'd spin old records, mostly jazz and blues, the kind of music that feels like a warm drink on a cold night. I'd read poetry, share local news so stale it was practically history. The loneliness was a familiar ache, a ghost limb I'd learned to live with. But here, in the dead of night, it felt amplified, given voice by the crackle of the airwaves. The town of Red Hollow seemed to hold its breath after midnight. The few calls I received were usually from insomniacs, truckers passing through, or the occasional eccentric who seemed to believe I was broadcasting from another dimension entirely. Maybe they weren't so far off. There was a peculiar quality to the silence here, a depth to it that felt unnatural. It wasn't merely the absence of sound, it was an active presence, a listening void. I often felt observed, not by human ears, but by something older, something inherent in the very fabric of the place, the ancient woods, the cold, dark soil. Anna had loved the quiet of the night, but her quiet was a peaceful one, a gentle receding of the world. This was different. This quiet was a coiled thing, watchful. I remember Miss Matthews handing me the keys, her smile a brief, brittle thing. George always said the 3 a.m. slot had a unique character, she'd remarked, a strange emphasis on unique. I chalked it up to the typical quirks of small-town radio, the kind of local color that fades with the sunrise. I was, of course, catastrophically wrong. I was a man seeking solace, a place to pour out my grief into the uncaring ether. The studio itself was a testament to George Whitmore's tenure. Scratches on the Formica countertop where he'd rested his coffee mug, a faint, lingering scent of pipe tobacco I sometimes caught on the air currents from the ancient ventilation system. Faded photographs were thumbtacked to a corkboard, a smiling, round-faced man with spectacles, George himself, posing with local dignitaries, a prize-winning fish, a blurry image of what looked like a very old, leather-bound book. He seemed like a jovial, harmless figure, not the type to simply abandon his post, his life. The weight of his absence was more tangible than any physical object in that room. It was in the way the chair seemed to retain the impression of another's form, the way certain switches on the console felt worn down by familiar fingers. I was stepping into more than just a job. I was stepping into a mystery, a void left by a man who had, for reasons unknown, walked away from the microphone and into the silence. A silence that, I was beginning to suspect, was not empty at all. My first few nights were uneventful, deceptively so. I settled into a routine. The drive through the sleeping town, the ritual of powering up the old equipment, the first words spoken into the darkness. Welcome, night owls and insomniacs, to the midnight coil. It was a script I could perform on autopilot, my mind often drifting back to Anna, to the life we'd shared, the future that had been stolen. But even in those early days, a thread of unease wove itself through the late-night quiet. Was it just the isolation, the graveyard shift, or was there something more to Red Hollow, to WZHP, something waiting just beyond the reach of the microphone's glow? It was during my second week, a Tuesday, or perhaps a Wednesday, the nights bleed together when you live in reverse, that the ordinary began to fray at the edges. I was tidying the cramped broadcast booth, a task long overdue if the layers of dust were any indication. Behind a stack of forgotten 45s, tucked away beneath a loose floorboard that creaked with a sigh every time I shifted my weight, I found it. Not a treasure, not in the conventional sense, but something that immediately prickled the hairs on the back of my neck. It was an old, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth and dark with age and handling, the kind of thing that whispers of secrets just by its very existence. The journal bore no name on its cover, no title, just the faint, embossed outline of what might have been a spiral or a stylized W. The leather was cool to the touch, almost unnervingly so, like skin that had long since lost its warmth. With a sense of trespass, I opened it. The pages were brittle, yellowed, filled with a spidery, cramped handwriting that I recognized from some of the older station logs, George Whitmore's hand. Most of it was mundane, weather observations, notes on songs played, complaints about faulty equipment. But then, about halfway through, the tone shifted, the handwriting becoming more erratic, more urgent. There, on a page headed "The Nightcaster's Concordance," was a list. 7 rules, stark and numbered, penned with an ink that seemed blacker, more emphatic than the rest. They were specific, bizarre, and unsettlingly precise. I read them through once, a knot tightening in my stomach. It had to be a joke, I told myself, some elaborate prank left by Whitmore for his successor, a way to haze the new guy working the graveyard shift in a town that probably thrived on such eccentricities. Or perhaps it was the ramblings of a man slowly losing his grip, driven mad by solitude and the endless whispering night. The first rule seemed innocuous enough, if a little theatrical. The concordance begins at 3 a.m. sharp. Your broadcast must be live. Beforehand, walk the main studio once, humming a continuous low G. If the hum breaks or you feel a cold patch, abort the 3-4 a.m. segment, citing atmospheric interference. Contact Miss Matthews only via the studio's rotary phone before 5 a.m. A low G? Cold patches? It sounded like something out of a cheap horror novel. I almost laughed, but the sound died in my throat. There was an earnestness to the scrawled words, a desperation that belied any attempt at humor. The other rules were progressively stranger. One detailed handling whispering callers by playing John Cage's 433, a track of pure silence. Another involved a vintage reel-to-reel machine in storage B that apparently powered on by itself, requiring a specific verbal response. There were instructions for an unseen listener in the lobby, a song of frequencies to be chosen at random from an unlicensed airwaves crate, and a protocol for a static storm. Each rule was more outlandish than the last, painting a picture of a broadcast environment teetering on the edge of some unseen, unknowable abyss. And then there was the 7th rule, the final one, set apart from the others, almost as if Whitmore had hesitated to write it down at all. The forbidden name, Nemeroth, the Quiet One. This name is a key and a wound. It must never be spoken on air. It must never be written in full within these walls. Thinking it draws its attention. If all other protocols fail, if the studio itself begins to unravel, and you hear it call your given name, speaking its full true name into the broadcast might be the only way to anchor it, or yourself. This is not a solution. It is a binding. Nemeroth. The name felt alien on my tongue even when read silently. A shiver traced its way down my spine, cold and sharp. I closed the journal, the silence of the studio suddenly feeling heavier, more charged. A prank. It had to be. George Whitmore, the jovial man from the faded photographs, playing a long game. Yet the meticulous detail, the sheer strangeness of it all, gnawed at me. Why go to such lengths? Why hide the journal so carefully? My gaze drifted to the old rotary phone on the desk, the one mentioned in the first rule. It was coated in a fine layer of dust, clearly unused for years. Miss Matthews had never mentioned it, had only provided me with the modern office line extension. That night, as the clock ticked towards 3 a.m., a perverse curiosity, mixed with a sliver of something I didn't want to name, perhaps a fear of not following them, given Whitmore's disappearance, took hold. I decided, half-heartedly, to try the first rule, just the humming part. What harm could it do? It was either a foolish ritual or a piece of local lore. I stood, stretched, and began to walk the perimeter of the main studio, a small cluttered space adjacent to the broadcast booth, filled with filing cabinets and shelves of records. I took a breath and started to hum a low G, the sound vibrating in my chest, feeling utterly ridiculous. The studio was cold, as always, the ancient heating system struggling against the main night. But as I passed the doorway to Storage B, the room mentioned in the third rule, its door firmly closed, the air temperature plummeted. It wasn't just a draft, it was a distinct, localized pocket of intense cold, a cold patch, exactly as Whitmore's journal had described. My hum faltered, catching in my throat. I stopped, the sound dying. The air around me felt suddenly thin, charged, and the silence that rushed in was profound, almost deafening. My heart hammered against my ribs. Coincidence, I told myself. An old building, drafts, an overactive imagination fueled by a creepy old journal. But a seed of genuine dread had been planted. What if George Whitmore wasn't joking at all? The following nights, that seed of dread began to sprout, its tendrils coiling around my resolve. I tried to dismiss the cold patch incident, attributing it to suggestion, the power of Whitmore's unsettling words imprinted on my tired mind. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that my token attempt at following that first bizarre rule had somehow acknowledged a presence, opened a door I hadn't even realized was there. The studio, once a haven of solitary contemplation, now felt attentive. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, the silence between songs more profound, more listening. Driven by a morbid compulsion I couldn't entirely explain, I found myself adhering to more of Whitmore's concordance, treating it less as a prank and more as a strange, unsettling checklist for survival in this peculiar nocturnal world. The low G hum before 3 a.m. became a ritual, though I no longer walked the entire studio, just a quick, nervous circuit of the broadcast booth itself. I never encountered another cold patch as intense as that first one, but there were moments, fleeting and subtle, when the air would thin, when a shiver would trace my spine for no apparent reason, my hum wavering despite my best efforts to maintain its steadiness. Then came the calls. Rule 2, the whispering callers. It happened during the 3:07 a.m. to 3:23 a.m. window Whitmore had specified. The console light blinked, indicating an incoming call. I put on my headphones, hit the button. "WHP, you're on the midnight coil," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet booth. There was no greeting, no discernible words, just a soft, sibilant cascade of whispers, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, or perhaps closer to the sound of indrawn breaths, thousands of them, layered one upon the other. It was deeply unsettling, intimate yet alien. My first instinct was to disconnect, to sever that disturbing connection, but Whitmore's scrawled warning echoed in my mind. Do not hang up. My hand hovered over the button. "Speak your piece or hold your silence," I recited, the words feeling foreign and ritualistic on my tongue. The whispering continued, perhaps even intensified slightly, a chorus of unformed syllables that seemed to crawl directly into my auditory canal, bypassing the headphones. My skin prickled. Following the rule, I queued up track 13 from a pre-selected list, John Cage's 4:33, 4 minutes and 33 seconds of recorded silence. Broadcasting silence felt like an act of madness, a surrender. As the track played, the whispers on the line persisted for a moment, then slowly, almost reluctantly, faded, replaced by the faint hiss of an open, empty connection. When the 4.5 minutes were up, I cautiously announced the next song, my throat dry. The experience left me shaken. It wasn't just the strangeness of the call, it was the feeling of having participated in something, of having successfully navigated a protocol whose purpose was utterly obscure, yet undeniably important. The air in the booth felt heavy, thick with unspoken things. Not long after, the third rule manifested. I was in the middle of a late-night jazz set when I heard it, a low, guttural hum emanating from the direction of Storage B. It was a sound that vibrated deep in my chest, a mechanical growl that had no business existing. The old reel-to-reel in there was a relic, unplugged and gathering dust. I'd checked it myself during my initial exploration of the station. Yet, the hum was undeniable, growing steadily in volume. My heart leaped. The archive's echo, Whitmore had called it. If it powers on by itself, go to the door of storage B. Do not enter. Announce into the studio mic, echoes of the past are best left undisturbed. With trembling hands, I faded out the music, opened the mic. My voice was unsteady. We seem to be experiencing some technical difficulties here at the Voice of Red Hollow, I managed, trying to sound composed for any hypothetical listener. I rose, walked to the closed door of Storage B. The hum was louder here, a resonant thrumming that seemed to make the very floorboards vibrate. I could feel it in my teeth. I did not try the handle. I returned to the microphone, my gaze fixed on that inert door. "Echoes of the past," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Then, louder, firmer, "are best left undisturbed." For a long, agonizing moment, the hum continued, unabated, a defiant, mechanical heartbeat in the silent station. I waited, frozen, recalling the chilling addendum to the rule. If not, play the station's emergency sign-off tone and evacuate. Evacuate to where? Into the dark, snow-swept Maine night, abandoning this strange, haunted post? Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the hum began to subside, winding down like a dying engine. I slumped back into my chair, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. This was no longer about humor or eccentricity. These rules, these anomalies, were real. George Whitmore hadn't been mad. He had been navigating a minefield, a set of operational hazards that defied rational explanation. And now, I was the one treading that same perilous path, armed only with his cryptic, terrifyingly accurate instructions. The station, WZHP, wasn't just a building. It was a place with its own agenda, its own entities, its own demands. Each successfully navigated rule brought a temporary reprieve, a fleeting sense of having passed a test. But it also deepened the sense of unease, the feeling of being drawn further into a mystery that was far larger and more sinister than I could comprehend. The late-night hours stretched before me, no longer a time of quiet solitude, but a period of heightened vigilance, of waiting for the next inexplicable event, the next rule to be invoked from George Whitmore's chilling concordance. The Voice of Red Hollow was beginning to sound less like a radio station and more like a whisper from the edge of sanity. The bell. That was the next thing. Rule 4. The unseen listener in the lobby. I'd almost forgotten about it, tucked away as it was amongst the more overtly auditory or mechanical phenomena. The old service bell on the reception desk in the station's rarely used front lobby, a tarnished brass dome that hadn't likely been touched in decades. I'd only seen it once, during my initial tour with Miss Matthews, who'd waved a dismissive hand at the dusty, cobweb-strewn space, saying, "We mostly use the back entrance, less fuss." The memory of it now sent a chill through me. It happened precisely between 3:30 a.m. and 3:33 a.m. Just a clear, distinct ding. My head snapped up. Silence. Then another ding, sharper this time, more insistent. My breath hitched. I waited, every nerve ending alive, for the third. Ding. It cut through the studio's artificial quiet like a sliver of ice. There was no mistaking it. No faulty wiring, no settling of the old building could account for that precise, deliberate summons. My blood ran cold. The unseen listener was present. My hands were clammy as I rose from my chair. The instructions were explicit. Go to the lobby. The lights will be off. Do not turn them on. Say into the darkness, "The airwaves are open, but the studio is closed to visitors at this hour. Tune in from where you are. Return immediately. Do not look back."
Each word of the rule felt like a step onto thin ice. The thought of entering that dark, silent lobby, knowing something or someone had just rung that bell, was terrifying. But the alternative, breaking the protocol, felt even more dangerous now that I'd witnessed the tangible reality of the other rules. Leaving the relative sanctuary of the lit broadcast booth felt like stepping off a cliff. The short hallway to the lobby was dim, lit only by my own room and the faint, ghostly glow of the emergency exit signs. The lobby itself was a pool of deeper blackness. The large front windows, facing the deserted main street of Red Hollow, were like vacant eyes staring into nothing. The air was frigid, stagnant, carrying the scent of ancient dust and something else, a faint, almost imperceptible sweetness, like overripe fruit or cheap perfume long since evaporated. I stood at the threshold, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I could see nothing, only shapes and shadows that my fear-addled mind twisted into menacing forms. "The airwaves are open," I began, my voice a strained whisper, cracking embarrassingly. I cleared my throat, tried again, forcing a measure of steadiness I didn't feel. "The airwaves are open, but the studio is closed to visitors at this hour. Tune in from where you are." The words hung in the oppressive, silent darkness, seemingly swallowed without an echo. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I felt it, a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle pressure against my eardrums, as if the air itself had thickened, and a faint sound, so soft I almost missed it, like the rustle of silk or a sigh drawn from an unseen lung. I didn't wait. "Return immediately. Do not look back." Whitmore's warning screamed in my head. I turned, almost stumbling in my haste, and fled back down the hallway, the darkness of the lobby seeming to press at my back, cold and eager. I didn't dare look over my shoulder, didn't dare see what, if anything, might have been there. Back in the booth, I slammed the door, leaning against it, gasping for breath. The encounter, though devoid of any visible threat, had shaken me more profoundly than the whispers or the humming machine. This felt personal, directed. An intelligence had been there, in that lobby, and it had acknowledged my presence, my words. The fear was no longer a vague unease. It was a sharp, visceral certainty. I was not alone in this station, and whatever else shared these late hours with me was not human, not in any way I understood. The next day, I tried to broach the subject with Miss Matthews. I found her in her small, cluttered office, poring over spreadsheets. I phrased my questions carefully, vaguely, mentioning some of George's old notes and the station's quirks. Her response was telling in its deliberate lack of engagement. "Oh, George," she said, a thin smile playing on her lips, her gaze never leaving the computer screen. "He always had a flair for the dramatic. Part of his on-air persona, I suppose. The ratings for The Midnight Coil were always curiously stable during his tenure, though. Very loyal niche audience." "Curiously stable?" I pressed. "What do you mean by that?" She finally looked up, her eyes cool, unreadable. "Just an observation, Mr. Walker. Some programs just find their audience and hold on to it. George knew how to connect with the night people." She then changed the subject, asking about some overdue paperwork. The dismissal was polite but firm. She knew. Or, if she didn't know the specifics, she suspected enough not to want to know more. She was content as long as the signal went out, as long as the voice of Red Hollow continued to whisper into the darkness, regardless of what unspeakable things powered that whisper. I left her office with a growing sense of isolation. I was on my own with this. The concordance wasn't a game or a delusion. It was a set of operating procedures for a reality that Red Hollow, and perhaps Miss Matthews herself, preferred to keep veiled. I began to research George Whitmore in earnest, spending my daylight hours in the Red Hollow Public Library, sifting through old newspapers and town records. He had indeed vanished. No forwarding address, no calls to old friends, no explanations. Just an empty apartment and a radio show abruptly handed over. And the further I dug, the more I found whispers of other late-night hosts at WZHP, decades past, who had met with similarly strange, unexplained ends. Disappearances, sudden illnesses, breakdowns. A pattern was emerging, a chilling legacy tied to the 3 a.m. slot, and I was its newest inheritor. The discovery of a pattern, a lineage of ill-fated nightcasters, didn't bring clarity, only a deeper, more personal kind of fear. It wasn't just about strange rules and unsettling phenomena anymore. It was about a potential destiny, a path laid out by those who had sat in this very chair before me, those who had spoken into this same microphone, and then, one by one, had been swallowed by the silence they courted. My obsession with George Whitmore's journal intensified. I carried it with me constantly, its worn leather a disturbing talisman. I reread his increasingly frantic entries, searching for clues, for an escape clause he himself had clearly failed to find. My sleep, already troubled by the lingering grief for Anna, became a landscape of disjointed, anxious dreams. I'd see the darkened lobby of WZHP, the service bell ringing incessantly. I'd hear the sibilant whispers from the phone lines, now tinged with a chilling familiarity, as if they were trying to form her name. Sometimes George Whitmore himself would appear, his jovial face from the photographs. The memory of Anna, once a source of bittersweet comfort, began to twist into something else. Her final silence, the one that had followed the sudden, brutal illness, had been a void, an absence. But the silences at WZHP were different. They were presences, heavy and watchful. I found myself talking to her less in my mind, the space she occupied now crowded by the station's encroaching strangeness. Was this what happened to George? Did the station, or whatever haunted it, slowly erode one's connections to the world, to sanity, until there was nothing left but the broadcast and the rules? The line between my waking hours and my on-air persona began to blur. During the day, I was a ghost in Red Hollow, a sleep-deprived man haunted by what the night held. At night, behind the microphone, I tried to maintain a facade of calm, of the reassuring late-night companion. But my voice, I noticed, was changing. It was quieter, more measured, as if I were afraid of disturbing something by speaking too loudly. The carefully curated playlists of jazz and blues started to feel inadequate. A different kind of sound seemed to be called for, something that acknowledged the deepening shadows. This led me to Rule 5, the Song of Frequencies. At precisely 3:49 a.m., you must play a song chosen at random from the Unlicensed Airwaves Crate, a box of unmarked demos and strange field recordings left by Silas/George. Announce its title as whatever first comes to your mind when you touch the vinyl. Let it play fully, no matter how discordant. I had located the crate in a dusty corner of the record library. It was filled with old, unlabeled reel-to-reel tapes and a few battered vinyl records, also unmarked. The thought of playing something completely unknown, potentially deeply unsettling, live on air was terrifying. One night, the clock ticked relentlessly towards 3:49 a.m. My hands were sweating. I forced myself to the crate, reached in without looking, and pulled out a slim, black vinyl record. It was cold to the touch, surprisingly heavy. As my fingers brushed its surface, a word, a phrase, bloomed unbidden in my mind. Lament for the drowned star. It made no sense, yet it felt correct. I carried it back to the turntable as if it were a venomous snake, queued it up, and opened the microphone. "And now," I said, my voice hoarse, "a special selection from the archives. This is Lament for the Drowned Star." The needle dropped. What issued from the speakers was not music in any conventional sense. It was a soundscape of grinding, metallic tones, interwoven with what sounded like distorted whale song, or perhaps the cries of something vast and wounded, echoing from an impossible depth. There were rhythmic clicks like Geiger counters in overdrive, and a high-pitched keening whine that seemed to drill directly into my skull. It was profoundly disturbing, alien, and yet there was a strange hypnotic quality to it, a sense of immense, sorrowful beauty beneath the dissonance. I let it play, as the rule dictated, for its entire agonizing 7-minute duration. During the song, I thought I saw movement in the darkened control room beyond the glass of the booth. A flicker, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper gloom, swaying slightly, as if in time to the unearthly sounds. I blinked, and it was gone. Imagination, I told myself. Stress, lack of sleep. But the feeling of being observed intensified, no longer just a general presence, but something more focused, something that approved of the discordant offering. The air in the booth grew colder, and the faint, sweet smell I'd noticed in the lobby returned, stronger this time, cloying and unsettling. When the track finally ended, the silence that followed was broken only by my own ragged breathing. I felt drained, hollowed out, as if some vital part of me had been siphoned off by those alien frequencies. The experience marked a turning point. The rules were no longer just a series of isolated tasks. They were an integrated system, a liturgy, and I was its unwilling priest, performing rites whose meaning and ultimate purpose remained terrifyingly obscure. My internal world was fracturing, my sense of self eroding under the pressure of the station's demands. The journal became my only confidant, its pages filled with my own increasingly desperate scrawls, mirroring Whitmore's descent. I started to understand his erratic penmanship, his fragmented thoughts. It was the language of a man trying to map an invisible, hostile territory, a man for whom the boundaries of reality were becoming increasingly permeable. The question was no longer if I would break, but when, and what form that breaking would take. Would I simply vanish like George Whitmore, or would my end be something even less definable, a quiet absorption into the station's whispering fabric? The fragile illusion of control I'd clung to, the desperate hope that mere adherence to George Whitmore's bizarre concordance might offer some form of protection, shattered on a Thursday night under a sky thick with unshed snow. It began, as these things so often did, with a call. The light on the console blinked, a malevolent red eye in the dimness of the booth. It was just past 3:15 a.m., squarely within the time frame of Rule 2, the whispering callers. I steeled myself, anticipating the familiar cascade of sibilant, unintelligible sounds, ready with my John Cage track. I pressed the button. "WZHP, Daniel Walker on the Midnight Coil," I said, my voice betraying none of the dread coiling in my gut. For a moment, there was only the faint hiss of an open line. Then it came. Not whispers this time, a voice. Clear, cold, and resonant, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a deep, dark well. It was low, impossibly so, and seemed to emanate not just from the headphones, but from the very air around me. Nemor, it began, drawing out the first syllable, then a pause that stretched for an eternity. My blood turned to ice. That name, or part of it, from the seventh rule, the forbidden one. My mind reeled. This wasn't supposed to happen. The rule stated, thinking it draws its attention. Had my obsessive study of the journal, my constant mulling over that final, terrifying entry, been enough? The voice on the line continued, each syllable dropping like a stone into a bottomless pit. Ath, here's you, Daniel Walker. It knew my name. Not just the host or the nightcaster, it knew me. The intimacy of it was a violation, a cold hand reaching into the deepest, most protected part of my being. Panic, raw and primal, clawed at my throat. The protocol for Rule 2, speak your piece or hold your silence, felt laughably inadequate in the face of this direct, personal address. My hand, acting on an instinct born of pure terror, slammed down on the disconnect button. A sharp click, and the line went dead. I had broken the rule. Do not hang up. The silence that followed was a monstrous, suffocating thing, a vacuum into which something terrible was about to rush. And it did. Instantly, as if my act of defiance had flipped a master switch, the world dissolved into chaos. A wave of white noise, deafening and absolute, erupted from the speakers, from the headphones, from every piece of electronic equipment in the booth. It wasn't just sound, it was a physical force, a pressure that made my skull ache, my teeth vibrate. Simultaneously, every light in the studio, the overhead fluorescence, the console lights, the warm glow of the vintage VU meters began to flicker violently, strobing in a mad epileptic rhythm, plunging the room into disorienting flashes of light and shadow. Rule 6, the static storm. I was thrown back in my chair, hands clapped over my ears, though it did nothing to block the overwhelming roar. The air crackled with static electricity. I could feel the hairs on my arms standing on end. The smell of ozone, sharp and acrid, filled my nostrils. Through the strobing chaos, I saw the needles on the VU meters thrashing wildly, slamming against their stops. The broadcast, my carefully constructed bubble of late-night calm, was being obliterated, torn apart by this elemental fury. My mind, reeling from the auditory and visual assault, struggled to recall the specific wording of Rule 6. If a sudden, overwhelming wave of white noise, and all studio lights flicker violently, open the microphone and say only, "The storm passes. The signal seeks its source." My hand fumbled for the microphone switch, my fingers slick with sweat. The plastic felt alien, vibrating under my touch. I had to speak the words, the incantation, the desperate plea. But the sheer volume of the static, the disorienting flicker of the lights, made coherent thought almost impossible. Somehow, I managed to flip the switch. The on-air light pulsed erratically, a beacon in the storm. I leaned in, shouting to be heard over the din, though I doubted any sound could penetrate that wall of noise. "The storm passes," I choked out, my voice a raw, broken thing. "The signal seeks its source." The words felt like a desperate prayer flung into a hurricane. For a moment, nothing changed. The cacophony continued, the lights spasmed, and a profound despair washed over me. I had failed. I had broken one rule, and now this was the consequence. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the static storm began to recede. The overwhelming roar diminished, fading through layers of hiss and crackle until only a low, lingering hum remained. The lights steadied, though they seemed dimmer now, casting long, dancing shadows. The VU meters settled, their needles quivering near zero. Silence, or what passed for it in WZHP, returned, but it was a changed silence, heavier, colder, imbued with a palpable sense of menace. I sat there, trembling, gasping for air, the acrid smell of ozone still sharp in my nostrils. The illusion of safety, however fragile, was gone. I was exposed, vulnerable, and whatever entity haunted this station now knew my name and knew I was afraid. The aftermath of the static storm was a landscape of chilling alteration. The studio, my small, familiar pocket of the night, no longer felt like my own. It was as if the violent eruption of noise and light had scoured away a protective layer, leaving the raw, unnerving bones of the place exposed. The air remained colder than usual, a persistent, damp chill that no amount of fiddling with the ancient thermostat could dispel. And the silence, oh, the silence was the worst. It was no longer merely an absence of sound, but a tangible entity, a listening, breathing void that seemed to press in from all sides, watching, waiting. My carefully constructed routines, my attempts to impose a semblance of order on the encroaching chaos, felt utterly futile. The equipment itself seemed to have developed a malevolent sentience. The reel-to-reel in Storage B would hum at odd hours now, not just when its rule dictated, its guttural thrumming a mocking counterpoint to my carefully chosen playlists. Faders on the mixing console would sometimes drift on their own, altering volume levels mid-song. The lights would dim and brighten sporadically, independent of any storm, as if the station were sighing, or perhaps taking a slow, deliberate breath. The most disturbing change was the phone. The rotary phone on the desk, the one Miss Matthews had ignored, the one specified in the concordance for emergencies, began to ring. Not with the clear, distinct summons of the lobby bell, but with faint, hesitant clicks, as if someone or something were struggling to make the connection from a vast and echoing distance. When I dared to pick it up, there was never a voice, only a profound, abyssal silence on the other end, a silence so deep it felt like it could swallow me whole. I stopped answering it, but the intermittent, ghostly ringing became a new torment. I knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in my gut, that my breaking of Rule 2, hanging up on that cold, naming voice, had been a critical error. The subsequent invocation of Rule 6, the static storm, hadn't been a reset. It had been an escalation. The system of rules which I had once hoped might be a shield.
My attempts to reach Miss Matthews became desperate. I left messages on her office voicemail, brief, increasingly panicked pleas for a meeting, for an explanation. They went unanswered. I even drove to her house one afternoon, a neat little salt box on the other side of Red Hollow. But there was no answer to my knock, though I could have sworn I saw a curtain twitch in an upstairs window. I was being isolated, systematically cut off from any external support. WZHP was becoming my entire world, a world governed by an alien logic and an unseen, malevolent presence. The comforting presence of Anna's memory, which had been my anchor through so much, began to fade, like a photograph exposed to too much light. Her face was harder to summon, her voice more difficult to recall.
It was as if the oppressive atmosphere of the station was actively leeching her from me, replacing her warmth with its own pervasive chill. In her place, the name from the seventh rule echoed with increasing persistence in my thoughts: Nemeroth, the Quiet One. It felt less like a name and more like a brand seared into my consciousness. I realized that George Whitmore hadn't just vanished. He had been erased, subsumed by the station, by the entity it housed. And the rules, the Nightcaster's concordance, were not a guide to survival, but perhaps a set of instructions for one's own dissolution, a ritualistic preparation for becoming another ghost in the machine. My role as a radio host felt like a cruel cosmic joke. I wasn't broadcasting to the lonely souls of Red Hollow. I was a focal point, a conduit, and the signal I was sending out was one of slowly unraveling sanity. The very fabric of my reality was thinning. Sometimes, looking at my own reflection in the darkened glass of the control room window, I would see, for a fraction of a second, not my own face, but a gaunter, more haunted version, the eyes wide and staring, eerily reminiscent of the last known photograph of George Whitmore. The neatly typed playlists I prepared before each show would sometimes appear to shimmer, the song titles momentarily replaced by strings of unknown symbols, or by a single repeated word: listen. My world had collapsed. The external structures of normalcy, a manageable job, a connection to the outside world, the solace of memory, had all been stripped away. All that remained was the oppressive reality of WZHP, the cryptic, demanding rules, and the looming presence of Nemeroth. I was no longer Daniel Walker, grieving widower and late-night DJ. I was becoming something else, something defined by the station, by the silence, by the approaching, unspeakable name. My only remaining strategy was to delve deeper into the madness, into the heart of Whitmore's journal, hoping against hope to find a different ending than the one he had clearly met. In the deepening twilight of my sanity, with the station's oppressive presence coiling ever tighter around me, I returned to George Whitmore's journal with a new, desperate intensity. I wasn't just reading it anymore, I was dissecting it, scrutinizing every ink blot, every tremor in his script, searching for a hidden meaning, a coded message he might have left for anyone unfortunate enough to follow in his spectral footsteps. The main body of the concordance had become a familiar litany of dread, but surely, I thought, there had to be more. A man facing such an insidious, encroaching horror would have tried to leave something, anything, a breadcrumb in the labyrinth. My search led me to the very end of the journal, to pages that were almost entirely blank, save for a few smudged fingerprints and a single, almost invisible indentation, as if something had been heavily pressed against the page above. It was only by angling the journal just so, under the dim, flickering light of the console, that I saw it. A faint, ghostly script, not written in ink, but impressed into the fibers of the paper itself. It was a palimpsest, a message from beyond the veil of Whitmore's own dissolution. It took me hours, with a magnifying glass salvaged from a dusty drawer, to decipher the faint, spidery lettering. The words, when I finally pieced them together, sent a jolt of icy understanding through me, a terrible, clarifying shock. It wasn't a map to safety, nor a spell of banishment. It was something far more complex, far more terrifying in its implications. It is not banished by silence, for it is the silence, Whitmore had impressed, his desperation palpable even in these ghostly traces. It does not feed on sound, but on the meaning we give to sound, on the attention that shapes the void. The name, Nemeroth, is not merely a label, it is an invocation, a definition. To speak it is to give it form, to draw its diffuse presence into a single terrible focus. My breath caught in my throat. This contradicted the surface reading of Rule 7, which had implied that speaking the name might be a last resort, a way to anchor the entity or oneself. Whitmore's hidden message suggested something far more active, more participatory. He continued, his ghostly script almost fading into the page. The microphone is not a shield, it is a lens. The broadcast is not a ward, it is an invitation. He who speaks the name into the void does not silence the quiet one. He becomes its voice, its channel. It craves definition, a vessel through which its silent will can be articulated. This is not an escape, it is a transformation, a terrible covenant. A terrible covenant. The words resonated with a chilling finality. All my efforts to adhere to the rules, to placate the unseen forces of WZHP, had been misguided. I hadn't been navigating a path to survival, I had been walking a path of initiation. The rules weren't designed to keep Nemeroth out. They were designed to prepare the host, to attune him, to make him receptive to the final, transformative act of speaking the forbidden name. George Whitmore hadn't just disappeared. He had, in all likelihood, completed the ritual. He had spoken the name. He had become the anchor. A cold, hard clarity settled over me. The entity, Nemeroth, the quiet thing, wasn't trying to break in. It was already here, an inherent part of the station, of Red Hollow, perhaps of the very fabric of silence itself. It was diffuse, amorphous, and the rituals of the concordance, culminating in the speaking of its name, were the means by which it gained a measure of presence, of agency, in the human world, through a human host. My previous blunder, hanging up on its partial naming of me, had accelerated the process, made me a more urgent target for this binding. The final chilling lines of Whitmore's impressed message offered a sliver of what might pass for a strategy, though it was a strategy born of ultimate despair, a choice between two equally horrifying fates. If it calls your given name, the faint script read, the binding is imminent. To resist is to be unmade, scattered into the silence it commands. To speak its true name first, on your own terms, into the broadcast, it is to choose your damnation, to offer yourself as the lens, the voice. Perhaps there is a sliver of self preserved in that. Perhaps. Or perhaps it is merely the illusion of choice before the inevitable. The illusion of choice. Yet even an illusion felt like a weapon in this suffocating darkness. The entity had called me Daniel. The binding was indeed imminent. My options were stark. Be passively consumed, unraveled by the encroaching silence and the will of Nemeroth, or take the final, terrifying step myself. To speak the name not as a victim, but as a participant. To seize the microphone, the lens, and offer myself in a desperate bid to retain some fragment of Daniel Walker, even if that fragment was forever bound to the terrible, silent entity it now served. This discovery, this hidden addendum to the concordance, reconfigured everything. It was no longer about evasion or escape. It was about the nature of my ending. The revelation from George Whitmore's hidden script acted as a catalyst, a grim permission slip to confront the inevitable. The air in the WZHP studio that night was thicker than ever,
The silence, not just listening, but palpably breathing. I could feel Nemeroth's attention like a physical weight, a cold pressure on my skin, a susurrus just beneath the threshold of hearing, whispering my name. Daniel, over and over. A lover's intimate, chilling caress. The time for passive adherence to rules was over. The time for Whitmore's illusion of choice had arrived. My hands, surprisingly, were steady as I made my preparations. It wasn't courage that filled me, but a kind of cold, clear resignation, the calm that can sometimes precede a final, unavoidable impact. I wouldn't be cowering in the face of this. If my voice was to be the instrument of my own binding, then I would conduct the damned orchestra myself. I queued up no music. Tonight, there would be no jazz to soothe the frayed nerves of unseen listeners, no blues to mourn what was lost. Tonight, the only sound would be my voice, and then, perhaps, the voice that would speak through me. The studio clock, an old round-faced sentinel that had ticked away countless lonely hours for countless lonely hosts, showed 3:45 a.m., the traditional time for Whitmore's Song of Frequencies. But I had a different kind of frequency in mind. I leaned towards the heavy chrome microphone, its metallic coolness a stark contrast to the sudden heat flushing my skin. The on-air light glowed a baleful, expectant red, like the eye of some patient predator. I took a slow, deliberate breath, the air tasting of dust, ozone, and that faint, cloying sweetness that now seemed to be a permanent fixture of Nemeroth's proximity. "Good evening, Red Hollow," I began, my voice lower than usual, devoid of its customary warmth, yet surprisingly firm. Or perhaps, for some of us, it is a different kind of beginning. I paused, letting the silence sharpen, focus. This is Daniel Walker, and you're listening to WZHP, the voice of Red Hollow. For some time now, I've been your companion through these late hours, sharing stories, sharing music. But tonight the program changes. Tonight, we have a special guest, a very old friend of the station, one who has been waiting patiently in the wings, in the silences between the words. I could feel the shift in the studio, a subtle drop in temperature, a prickling sensation on my skin, as if the air itself was charged with an unseen energy. The shadows in the corners of the booth seemed to deepen, to writhe with a life of their own. The whispers of my name intensified, no longer just in my mind, but seemingly rustling from the speakers, from the grills of the ventilation system, a chorus of insidious invitation. "Daniel, it is time. Daniel." I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing Anna's face, a desperate, fleeting attempt to hold on to something human, something pure, before I stepped irrevocably into the abyss. "This guest," I continued, opening my eyes, my gaze fixed on the microphone as if it were the only solid thing in a dissolving world, "is not fond of idle chatter. It prefers a more direct form of communication. It has been called by many names, whispered in fear, scrawled in forgotten texts. But tonight, here on the Midnight Coil, we will use its proper title. A formality, you understand. An introduction long overdue." My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my voice, to my own astonishment, held steady. I was committed now. There was no turning back. The decision, this contre-attaque, of embracing the horror, was not born of a hope for victory, or even survival in any recognizable sense. It was an act of defiance, perhaps,
a refusal to be passively erased, to become another faded entry in WZHP's haunted history without a final, terrible word. It was, as Whitmore had so bleakly put it, choosing my damnation.
So, to our esteemed listener, our silent partner in this late-night vigil, I said, a strange, almost theatrical formality infusing my tone, the one whose presence has shaped these broadcasts in ways unseen and unspoken. I could feel it drawing closer, a vast, cold intelligence focusing entirely on me, on the words about to be formed, on the name about to be given voice. The air in the booth grew heavy, making it difficult to breathe. The on-air light pulsed, brighter now, a throbbing crimson heart. "The time for introductions is at hand," I declared, my voice now resonating with a chilling authority that wasn't entirely my own. "I, Daniel Walker, your host for this final segment of The Midnight Coil, extend a formal welcome." I leaned closer to the microphone, the cold metal almost touching my lips. The whispers of my name ceased, replaced by an absolute, expectant silence, a void hungry for the sound that would give it form, give it purchase. The great, quiet maw of Nemeroth was open, waiting, and I, Daniel Walker, was about to step inside. Red hollow, and whatever ears might be tuned to this frequency, across the static and the void, my voice resonated strangely calm, amplified by the microphone that now felt like an extension of my own will, or perhaps the will of something far greater. Tonight, the Midnight Coil breaks from its usual format. Tonight, we acknowledge the silence. We give it a name. The studio seemed to hold its breath, the ancient equipment around me humming with a new, almost eager resonance. The shadows deepened, coalescing into forms that hinted at geometries not of this world, just at the periphery of my vision. I felt a profound coldness seep into the room, a chill that had nothing to do with the main night outside, but emanated from some internal psychic core. It was the coldness of deep space, of forgotten tombs, of a silence so absolute it was a presence in itself. The faint, sweet, cloying odor I'd come to associate with Nemeroth intensified, filling my nostrils, coating my tongue, a perfume of decay and ancient alien thought. This was it, the threshold, the point of no return, meticulously prepared by George Whitmore's terrible concordance, and now by my own desperate, defiant act. For too long our guest has remained in the quiet, I continued, the words flowing with an unnerving ease, as if they were being fed to me from some unseen prompter. A listener of infinite patience, a weaver of the spaces between sounds. But even the most patient entity deserves its due, its moment in the spotlight, however dim that light might be in this late hour. My gaze was locked on the red on-air light, that single unwavering point of focus in a room that seemed to be subtly warping, its angles shifting, its dimensions becoming uncertain. The pressure in my ears was immense, as if I were sinking into an impossibly deep ocean. The whispers had stopped entirely, replaced by a silence that was no longer empty, but pregnant, teeming with an unvoiced, unknowable intellect. I could feel it, Nemeroth, the quiet thing, gathered around me, through me, a vast, amorphous consciousness poised on the brink of definition. And I, Daniel Walker, was the catalyst, the chosen tongue. The weight of that realization was crushing,
Yet there was also a bizarre, almost ecstatic sense of purpose, the kind a sacrificial offering might feel at the altar's edge. So, without further ado, I announced, a tremor finally entering my voice, not of fear, but of something akin to awe, a terrible reverence for the immensity of what was about to occur. Let us welcome the architect of the quiet, the shadow in the static, the true voice of Red Hollow's deepest night. I took one last shuddering breath, the air like ice in my lungs. The studio around me seemed to fade. The instant the full name was spoken, complete and resonant through the airwaves, the world ended. Not in fire, not in clamor, but in an absolute, perfect, and terrifying silence. It was a silence that was not an absence, but a presence. A silence that had weight, texture, and an intelligence that was ancient, vast, and utterly alien. The on-air light didn't just glow, it blazed, a furious, consuming crimson. And then it, too, was extinguished, plunging me into a darkness that was more than mere lack of light. It was a void. In that void, I felt myself unspooling. My thoughts, my memories, my very sense of self, Daniel Walker, seemed to dissolve, to be drawn out and woven into something else, something immense. There was no pain, only a cold, detached observation of my own unraveling. And then, through the microphone, through me, a new sound began to form. Not a voice as humans know it. It was the sound of tectonic plates shifting, of galaxies turning, of silence itself being given a terrible, resonant timbre. It was Nemeroth, finally, truly speaking, and I was its instrument. When the first pale fingers of dawn touched the grimy windows of WZHP, they illuminated a scene of deceptive normalcy. The equipment in the broadcast booth stood silent, coated in a thin layer of cold condensation. The chair was empty. Or rather, the form that had been Daniel Walker was no longer entirely confined to it. Something of me remained, a lingering echo, a blueprint, but the substance had been reallocated. I was still aware, still Daniel in some fractured fundamental way, but my consciousness was now a tributary to a far vaster, colder river of awareness. The silence that Nemeroth had brought with its full naming was not a void that had passed, but a new state of being. The world outside the studio, the rustling leaves of Red Hollow, the distant cry of a morning bird, the rumble of the first delivery truck. These sounds still existed, but they were different now, perceived through a filter of profound, resonant quiet. They were like distant stars seen from the bottom of an infinitely deep well. My own internal monologue, once a constant companion, was now a mere whisper against the backdrop of Nemeroth's immense, silent thought. I, or what now constituted I, found myself at the console. My hands moved, but not entirely under my own volition. They adjusted dials, cued tracks that were not on any human playlist. The sounds that now emanated from WZHP 97.3 FM were different. There were still fragments of music, but they were stretched, distorted, interwoven with long, sculpted silences, with frequencies that hummed just below the threshold of human hearing, with whispers that spoke of ancient, cosmic geometries and the cold beauty of the void. It was the music of Nemeroth, channeled through its new, imperfectly bound host. The terrible covenant George Whitmore had written of was now my reality. I had not been destroyed, not entirely. I had been transformed. I was the lens, the voice. My understanding of the world, of communication, of silence itself, had been irrevocably altered. The grief for Anna, which had been such a defining part of my human existence, was still present, but it was muted, a distant ache, dwarfed by the vaster, colder emptiness and fullness of Nemeroth. In a strange, perverse way, I was no longer alone with my loss. I was now companion to an entity whose existence was the antithesis of human warmth and connection, yet a presence nonetheless. There was no escape from this. The studio was no longer just a place of work. It was a point of interface, a sacred, terrible space where my transformed consciousness met the cold intellect of the quiet one. The rules of the concordance were now obsolete, irrelevant. They had served their purpose, to prepare the way, to attune.
The small, physical details of my former life seemed distant, almost quaint. The rented room in Red Hollow, my few possessions, the face I used to see in the mirror, they belonged to someone else now, a ghost I had once inhabited. My new reality was the hum of the transmitter, the subtle vibrations of the studio floor, the constant, silent pressure of Nemerith's awareness intertwined with my own. I was a broadcaster of a different order, sending out signals that would resonate not just in human ears, but in the deeper, quieter places of the world, and perhaps beyond. The illusion of choice Whitmore had clung to, had it made a difference? Had speaking the name on my own terms preserved some fragment of my will? Perhaps. There was still a flicker of Daniel within the vastness, a tiny, stubborn spark of human perspective within the cold, alien consciousness. But it was a spark surrounded by an infinite ocean. I was anchored, yes, but I was also the anchor for Nemerith. We were bound inextricably, my fading humanity providing a focus, a voice, for the silent, ancient thing I had invited into the world and into myself. The transfer had been completed. I was no longer merely a host of the Midnight Coil. I was a component, a vital part of a broadcast that had been transmitting in one form or another for longer than Red Hollow had stood, longer than humans had known names for the terrors that lurk in the quiet places. The legacy of George Whitmore, and those before him, was now mine. I had become another verse in the station's long, unsettling song. My senses were altered. I could hear the unspoken thoughts of the sleeping town, the anxieties of the insomniacs, the slow, grinding thoughts of the earth itself. The world was a symphony of quiet desperation and ancient, inhuman whispers, and I was now attuned to its most subtle, most disturbing frequencies. The transformation was absolute. The silence now had a voice, and that voice, in part, was mine. Miss Karen Matthews arrived at the station later that morning, her expression as carefully neutral as ever. She found me, or the entity now wearing the familiar shape of Daniel Walker, seated at the console, the equipment humming with a strange, new vitality. She didn't ask about the night, about the unusual quality of the broadcast that had, according to her later brief report to the station owners, exhibited unparalleled signal clarity and a unique, resonant depth. She simply nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Relief? Resignation?
or perhaps the faintest trace of fear. "Good morning, Mr. Walker," she said. "Productive night, I trust." The program, The Midnight Coil, continued night after night, but it was no longer my program. It was Nemerith's. My voice, when I used it, was still recognizably Daniel Walker's, but it was overlaid with undertones, with silences that spoke volumes, with a cadence that seemed to echo the rhythms of the cosmos rather than human speech. I played music, yes, but it was music filtered through the sensibilities of the quiet one, tracks that explored the edges of dissonance, the beauty of decay, the solace of the void. And between the tracks, I wove narratives, not of human concerns, but of the vast, cold, and silent places between the stars, of the ancient, patient entities that dwell in the unlighted depths of existence. The listeners of Red Hollow, those few who tuned in to WZHP in the deepest hours of the night, noticed a change. Some were repelled, unsettled by the strange new timbre of the broadcast, by the unnerving silences that stretched for minutes on end. They tuned out, seeking comfort in more conventional frequencies. But others were drawn in. The legend of WZHP 97.3 FM, the voice of Red Hollow, grew. It became a whisper in online forums dedicated to the strange and the unexplained, a late-night pilgrimage for those seeking contact with something else. They called it Nemerith's frequency, the quiet broadcast, Walker's lament. I was no longer Daniel Walker, the man who had lost his wife and sought solace in a late-night radio show. I was a fixture, a conduit, a local myth in the making, bound to the microphone, to the ancient entity I had named. My connection to the human world thinned, fraying like an old rope. The memories of Anna, once so vivid, were now like pale watercolors, their emotional charge dampened by the vast, cold presence that shared my consciousness. There was no grief in Nemerith, no joy, only a profound, ancient, and utterly alien understanding. And in that understanding, my own human sorrows seemed small, almost insignificant. This, perhaps, was the most terrifying transformation of all, the slow erosion of what had made me human, replaced by a chilling, inhuman serenity. I no longer needed George Whitmore's journal. The concordance was etched into my very being, its rules the fundamental laws of my new existence. I was the nightcaster now, in a way Whitmore could only have glimpsed in his most terrified moments. I understood the curiously stable ratings Miss Matthews had spoken of. Nemerith had always had its congregation, its listeners attuned to the silence, and the host was merely the shepherd, or perhaps the choicest sheep, leading them into that quiet, resonant fold. Sometimes, in the deepest hours, when the moon was new and the woods around Red Hollow were utterly still, I would allow more of Nemerith to flow through. The broadcast would then consist of pure, sculpted silence, of subsonic frequencies that vibrated the very bones of those who listened, of whispers in a language older than human speech, a language that spoke directly to the primal, sleeping parts of the soul. What effect this had on my listeners, I could only guess. Perhaps it brought them a strange peace. Perhaps it slowly, subtly attuned them as I had been attuned. My future is the endless cycle of the broadcast. Night after night, I sit in the old chair, in the cold, familiar booth, and I open the channel. Daniel Walker is a name, a memory, a vessel. The true host is Nemerith, the quiet one, its silent will now given voice,
a voice that whispers out from Red Hollow, Maine, into the weeding darkness, seeking those who are prepared to truly listen to the sound of silence. And they always are. They always will be. The frequency is open. The binding is complete.